Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 127 of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells. I've got Joe Meade with me, and tonight we're recapping Week 14 in the Big Ten. That, of course, was rivalry week, the last week of the regular season. Joe, probably not your favorite time to come on and record, but we're still going to get through it. We got a couple other games. We started off Black Friday, Joe, with Iowa heading down south to Nebraska, and it was an uncharacteristic shootout. 24-16 Iowa at halftime, and then it was all Hawkeyes in the second half. Just a really good offensive performance for the Hawkeyes. Obviously, getting to 40. Johnson for Nebraska adds 200 and a touchdown. This was, I think we both predicted Iowa to get the victory here, but maybe not quite in this fashion.
Yeah, Sean, I was kind of surprised that we even hit like the 30s in this game,
Yeah.
either team, let alone into the 40s. But
The
kind of,
line, the over-under was 38.5. Iowa got that by themselves.
yeah, that in and of itself to me is insane, Sean. I think the big storyline here is kind of what we said all year with Nebraska, just lacking consistency defensively. Um, I think Emmett Johnson's been a real bright spot for the Huskers, but to be honest with you, Sean, the way the year started and seeing what they were capable of in spurts to end this way, can't be anything but disappointing. You do have Emmett Johnson back next year, and I still think he did some really good things, but overall. Not too impressed with the Hawkeyes, and I mean, sorry, not too impressed with the Cornhuskers. Very impressed with the Hawkeyes, and for them to come out in the second half and shut down Nebraska and really take over that game in Stadium, kind of shows the separation between the two programs of late. To be completely honest with you, I think this is more indicative of a trend, and for Matt Rule to go 7-5 year two, I think you can't call it anything but a disappointment for Nebraska fans, especially given the way they were dominated in uh in three of their five losses. So
Yeah, and this one, Joe, was one where it was a shootout and it didn't seem like Nebraska could keep up. Iowa was like, you know what, you can score here. You're not going to score next possession. And they didn't. I was pretty impressed with Iowa here. They clearly have their identity. Probably the best that this version of Iowa has looked. I know maybe not record wise, but they are like definitely a top 25 team in the country. They've had a really tough schedule. Um, they finish drives. Like these are things that, previous years Iowa teams that ended up, winning the Big Ten West probably don't maybe get to 6 wins this year, but probably don't go to a bowl. So I think this was a good step for Iowa. I know it's the only year that they're going to have Mark Gronowski, but it seems like that they are putting their quarterbacks in slightly better positions than they have in the past. Like a couple years there, it seemed like whoever, like you could have put prime Tom Brady in there and he wouldn't have been able to do anything. So good for Iowa, and then Nebraska, Joe. Disappointing season. I don't know what really they could get out of their bowl, but they will be going probably to, being that the other teams that got 6 wins, some of those bowls might want to take like a Penn State over Nebraska, because we know it's not just strictly based on wins anymore, which is why Michigan went to the Tampa Bowl in Tampa last year despite having less wins than the teams above them. But yeah, disappointing for Nebraska here and pretty good for Iowa, and we'll have to see where both those teams will be going for their bowls. All right, Joe, 7:30 on Friday night was the game for the Old Oak and Bucket in West Lafayette. Hoosiers came in needing a win to qualify for the Big Ten championship. That's exactly what happened. A little bit of a slow start, but a nice end to the second quarter, and then the second half was more like it for Indiana. Final score ends up pretty much where we thought. Hoosiers win 56-3. Joe, not really much to go over here.
no, I think Indiana proved why they're a top two team in the country, and Purdue kind of proved that. While I think they did make strides on the field this year, record's still what it is, only a one win improvement from last year. So think Purdue definitely is going to go into the offseason with a lot of work to do. And Indiana, kind of just a clinical performance. Roman Hemby rushed very well, pardon me. And, Mendoza didn't really have to do much of anything. I don't think he's probably in the front runner for the Heisman unless he goes off on Saturday anymore, if you're going to pick one thing for me to critique. And then the defense, still as dominant as ever. Eden Fisher played very well. I thought They didn't have to get much pressure. I think they only had one total sack, but it didn't matter. Purdue couldn't get anything done on offense. And, if you're Indiana, this was probably the perfect transition into the Big Ten title game. You expected them to handle business, and they really did. And, I kind of have a monotone uh inflection in my voice, and that's because it's what Indiana's done most of the year. We haven't really seen much disappointment over the last 2 years, to be quite frank. So very good on Indiana and Purdue. Off season begins right now.
Yep. For Indiana, it was a game where if you're box score watching, you probably look at Mendoza's line and you're not very impressed. And honestly, he did miss a couple throws early, but it was in the 20s and super windy. And Indiana noticed this pretty quickly, which is why they went to the ground so much. And then, of course, with 6 minutes left in the third quarter, Alberto Mendoza came in. So, week after a bye, I thought there was a few things that need to be cleaned up early in that game, but you know, it was like 14-3 Indiana, and Indiana had scored on two of their three drives, and the third one was just like because Mendoza threw up a ball that he thought was a free play, and the refs missed an offside, and the announcers seemed very impressed with Purdue's defense when they got one stop that probably shouldn't have been a stop, and then of course that sort of dominoed out of control. Um, this formula seems to really work, Joe, when they're the better team. But on the other hand, this year, what's been different is the disruptiveness from the defense. You said, like, they had 10 tackles for losses here. This is something that they've done all year against even some of the better teams and what they're going to have to do next week to win the Big Ten championship. But, yeah, this one got out of hand pretty quickly. Um, and you know, first undefeated regular season in Indiana history, and it's something that, if when we take the long term view of this, Indiana's 23-1 in the last two regular seasons. 23 wins is more than they had in the previous five. There are a couple of bowls in there too, so the transition long term for Indiana here is something that's really really cool as a Hoosiers fan. All right, let's turn the page to Saturday here, Joe, and unfortunately, we're going to start off in Ann Arbor, big noon kickoff. The game, Ohio State expels the Demons. They win 27-9. It was a game that ended up being pretty ugly for your Michigan Wolverines, Joe. But what happened early needed, like, for Michigan to win, they needed to get some things going early. They did get them going early. They had a nice first drive. They stalled out for a field goal. Immediate interception, stalled out for a field goal again. It seemed like the fact that Michigan only came away with 6 points from those two drives was probably going to mean they weren't going to win this game.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to take both views of this just because I've watched both teams a lot all year. For Michigan, kind of the same general themes showed up, except for the beginning. I think you start off, you have that huge run from Jordan Marshall. He was a little dinged up and got more dinged up as the game went on. But you get to Ohio State's 30-yard line and you only come away with 3 points. I thought that was more than acceptable considering the circumstances and Bryce kind of feeling them out. You follow that up with an interception on Julian Saint, who up to that point only threw four the whole year, and you get it at the 39, get up to the 11-yard line, and the play calling from there. That's kind of been
Yeah.
the Michigan story all year. The play calling, the execution, when they've needed a spark has not been there. They didn't necessarily need a spark then, but in hindsight, they really did. And then when you get on till you get to the defense, right? They come up big. They hold Ohio State at the goal line in spite of the dumb penalty by Jay Sean Barham. And then at 6-3, offense three and outs. Ohio State 4th and 5. You got to make a stop. The call was controversial. I don't think they were ever going to reverse that, to be honest. Can't make the stop there. Uh, then again on offense, you make a few really nice plays, but could only come away with three. And then that was the story. And Michigan had a few chances they really could have gotten Ohio State, and each time Ohio State held firm, which is something they've done the last 2 years. Give Jim Knowles and Matt Patricia credit for that. And then Ohio State kind of at the end of the half kind of just toyed with Michigan, ran the ball very well, ran the clock down, and then converted another third and short with a clinical pass from Julian Sayin. And the last thing I'll say, just recapping game, Sean, before I get into general themes, is at 17-9, Michigan gets a stop. They get them to punt the only time of the afternoon. You get a huge play to Donovan McCulley. You're at midfield. They proceed to go 1 yard after that, and they didn't throw past the sticks once. And that was the story of the Oklahoma game. kind of this weird conservative game plan. And I know they had receivers open, but they didn't really go for it. It felt like it's not an effort thing, just in terms of play calling. They didn't want to attack Ohio State at all. And then Ohio State did what the number one team in the country does. Michigan is a 10 or 15-yard punt, and Ohio State made them pay. And for Ohio State, I don't think they had to do anything too crazy in this game. I think they kind of kept it pretty basic, which is something they did not do last year. And for Michigan, they kept it way too basic. I think for a team that wanted to upset the number one team in the country and get into the college football playoff, I'd expect a lot more, not risky, but probably more exotic of a game plan. I think I should have, history being the teacher, I shouldn't have been surprised, and I really wasn't when I saw what I saw in the third and fourth quarter. Just total domination, and Michigan being one play away from being a play away. That was the story of the USC game up to the third quarter, the story of the Oklahoma game up to the fourth quarter, and then the story of this game in the third quarter. So, Michigan, I think you're still the youngest team in the conference, and we'll get into offseason themes later, but they clearly showed it. Ohio State's the defending national champion. They're the number one team in the country, and they did what number one teams in the country do. They make a few mistakes, but they don't let it snowball. And, credit to Ryan Day, balanced offensive attack, and they attacked Michigan and caught him napping a few times. And that's why I had the huge play from Carnell Tate and the huge fourth down conversion from Jeremiah Smith. So credit to Ohio State, and deservedly so. They will be playing in Indianapolis,
For the first
something they
time in a
haven't done
while.
since 2020, which is insane considering the success both them and Michigan really as the top two perennial Big Ten programs have had. But now there's separation. I think last year proved it, and this year on the field accentuated it.
I don't I think preparation wise, Michigan came ready to play. Like
Yeah.
they looked good early, they get the turnover. It just seemed like after that, they didn't really make the necessary adjustments. It was the same sort of theme in all three of their losses here this year, Joe, where they were clearly the worst team and they weren't able to do things to sort of bridge that gap. And, you know, I think there's obviously some long term coaching problems there where they probably do have to move on from Moore at some point. Doesn't look like that's going to happen this year. But both teams made some mistakes. Ohio State made Michigan pay for theirs. Michigan didn't really make Ohio State pay for theirs. Like they get 3 points off the turnover. Like they get the ball back down 8, like you said. Don't get anything out of that. Just like you had to convert a couple big plays early to get yourself in the game late. And, Ohio State sort of used that middle 8 to pull away. And then after that, it was just ground and pound and a real sort of demoralizing finish here. And this could have been an uglier scoreline if, it wasn't snowing and they started to air it out a little bit. But Ohio State's offensive line was the big winner here for me. Michigan's defensive line is really solid, and they did nothing. Sayan had maybe one throw where he was rushed a little bit. And then, of course, Bo Jackson gets over 100 yards on the ground. So, the question for Ohio State, Joe, all year has been, well, what's Julian Sayin going to look like when he doesn't have a ton of time? That didn't really happen here.
No.
You know, it was, they kept talking about it on the broadcast with Wink Martindale. They're like, well, he needs to get more pressure on the quarterback, but also if you leave either of these guys on one-on-one, they're going to probably get a big play. So he wasn't really able to balance that. And I at this point, Joe, I think there are only a few teams that could potentially beat Ohio State, and I think even them, they have to play like a pretty perfect game. It seems like if Ohio State plays anywhere near their best, they're probably 7 to 10 points better than the number 2 team.
I agree. The field versus them is an interesting bet. I'd be interested to see where that shakes
I
out.
would think it's probably 60% Ohio State.
Yeah, I think Ohio State would be like closer to 70-30 versus the field. And of course, anything's possible, but they haven't showed any weaknesses of late.
And if you have to look at long-term view for them, it seems like at this point the winner of the Big Ten championship will be number 1 and the loser will be number 3. Don't really know if that still means they won't play again until the championship. Like, not the Big Ten championship preview, but there isn't like a whole lot on the line here, other than
No,
but
except the trophy
except
and
the
conference
trophy.
title, which of course
But
matters to a lot of people. But
But if you're starting to, push out the path for Ohio State here to return to the national championship and win it, like their first round game is going to be probably against the 8 or 9 seed, which will be a combination of Alabama, Oklahoma, Notre Dame, Texas A&M.
Maybe Miami, but I doubt it.
Like
Yeah, not Miami.
you'd have to
Yeah,
think Ohio State is 10+ point favorites against any of those teams. And then the 4 or 5 is, Oregon or Texas Tech or Georgia. You'd have to think that, it's probably 7 to 10 points there too. So, the path is really there for Ohio State to do it again. And with this year, the 5 conference champions are still in there, but not top 4, right? So, I don't know if teams are gonna, like, the bottom of the bracket last year was way weaker than the top. I don't know if we're gonna see that this year, which I think does benefit Ohio State, like, a little bit. But that's for a different day. We don't have our conference champion yet. Let's go to another rivalry game out west, Joe, between Oregon and Washington. This was a game where Oregon, really dominated the first half, but Washington finishes the half with a nice touchdown drive, and you look up and it's 13-7 Oregon. Feels like it should be a lot more than that, but Oregon sort of cruised in the second half to a 26-14 win, and likely a home game in the college football playoff.
yeah, and give credit to Oregon here. They made plays each time to kind of extend the lead, especially the one that Malik Benson late in the game. Um, to me, Dante Moore continues to impress. Manages the game well, makes plays when he has to. And this was a game Oregon didn't have much success on the ground at all. They only averaged about 2.5 a carry. I thought Washington's defense actually played one of the better games they did in their more matchup games. But Oregon's defense, man, Dan Lanning, give that unit a lot of credit. I thought this was a game Damon Williams and Denzel Boston would have success. Boston had 4 receptions for 25 yards. Jonah Coleman, Adam Muhammad, I think was a bright spot. He'll clearly be a feature back for the Huskies in 2026, but they were shut down for the most part. And, you know, when Washington gets one aspect of their game going, then it opens up the other two. That never really happened. And unfortunately for Washington, that's something we've seen in their losses. Happened against Michigan, Wisconsin, and certainly Ohio State. And you know, that's kind of the story. I think they're a good offense that could really exploit bad teams, but against the elite defenses, they're not quite there yet. I think they could get there with Jed Fish, but this year showed that there's still a lot of work to do. And then on defense, I'm not going to criticize the defense too much, honestly, Sean. I thought they did a pretty solid job. If you handle the Oregon rushing attack, that's normally a big portion of the battle. They just couldn't handle it after that. So, um, really good work by Oregon. I thought this would be a really dangerous game for them. And to be honest with you, aside if they didn't hit that Benson play, that game could have been interesting, but they were in control most of the way, I felt like.
Yeah, I was really impressed with them. Like you said, Joe, it seems like Washington's offense really takes a step back when they face like a good defense. That happened again here. Like the defenses that they've lost to are even Wisconsin has a pretty good defense, and Thieneman, I think his name was the spy on Damon Williams, and he wasn't really a threat on the ground. I mean, it felt like that guy was all over the field on defense, and I think Washington's defense gave them a shot. You keep a team like Oregon in the mid-20s, you at least have a shot. But Oregon played the game that they needed to. And Joe, Oregon's a real interesting team because they just have really like the one. They've only played one playoff team, which they lost at home. They did beat Penn State on the road at the time. Thought it was a good win. They beat Iowa. They beat USC. They've definitely proven that they're a step ahead of the just off the playoffs tier. But they've only played one playoff team, and that was a game in which they sort of like got dominated for a half. So they're probably going to be in that 6-10 range, 6-8 range. Probably going to be hosting a game. You'd have to think that they're going to be favorites going into that game, but yeah, they just got the job done here. Dante Moore, it doesn't seem like he's really trying out there. It's so easy for him at times. He'll be like, oh, scramble, I guess I have to get 3 yards, and he'll get 3 yards. And then he has a rushing touchdown this game, and he makes throws. But Oregon's a team that I think might go a little bit under the radar because they don't have the flashy resume that some of these other teams have where, like they might be able to compete with a team up near the top. Um, they aren't going to be going to the Big Ten championship, Joe. I don't really like they won last year, and obviously we saw what happened after that. I don't know if they're going to be all that disappointed about it. They don't have to play another game; they get to host. Like, I think they'll be just fine at 11-1. All right, Joe. Let's go down to California. UCLA goes to the LA Memorial Coliseum to play USC. Um, USC obviously lost last week. They knew they wouldn't be going to the playoff. This was a pretty tight game early. UCLA actually led at halftime, but 3 touchdowns to 0 in the second half propelled USC to a 29-10 victory here. Maavo was solid. King Miller was solid. Makai Lemon was solid. It ended up being a pretty easy day at the office for USC, but definitely was pretty tight there in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really feel that. I think USC most of the year, on a similar theme to Washington, but in a better fashion. USC showed a lot of improvement this year, and I don't want to have a negative tone in my voice. I don't intend to, but they just handle business against the bad teams. They did that this year because I think Illinois is still a solid team in spite of what we've seen in certain spurts this year. So USC, I think good year overall. I think next year, kind of similar to Michigan, you're going to need to see a lot more. Jade Maeva will be a senior. You have that number one recruiting class or top three recruiting class, depending on the sites you frequent, and then King Miller, you have something there too. So especially as a freshman, so he has at least 2 more years there, considering if he stays, which I don't see a reason he wouldn't. So I look at this team shot. I think there's a lot of potential, and they handle business. And solid 9-win year for USC. I think there was meat on the bone, particularly the Notre Dame and Oregon games, and the Illinois ones. Probably like their 9-3 to me was more impressive than Michigan's, but it probably stings a little more because probably two of those three games were winnable to them, and they could have been the college football playoff.
And dude, it's a conversation going along nationwide, Joe, with Texas right now, and that Texas is 9-3 with a loss to Ohio State. I think you can easily make that argument here about USC too. They're 9-3. They played on the road against Notre Dame. Like if they play Eastern Illinois and win 66-0, where are they in terms of the college football playoff? You'd have to think that they have the win against Iowa. They have the win against Michigan. Like there's a real way that they're in if they're 10-2. But we're never gonna know. But I think it was a good step. Like they're obviously aiming for more, and if next year doesn't, if there's not an improvement next year, I think some questions need to be asked. But you can, I think this season when you look at it from a whole, yes, it stinks it didn't make the playoff, but I think we can still call it a success. Like you said, top recruiting class. Their schedule next year, Joe, really tough. And it's not even for sure yet if the Notre Dame game is still happening. This year was the last year of the agreement, so if they get Notre Dame again, they're going to have an incredibly tough schedule next year. But should be interesting to look out for next fall. All right, Joe, let's go up to Minnesota. Minnesota gets to win number 7 with a 17-7 win over Wisconsin. Darius Taylor gets to 100 yards. PJ Fleck and the Gophers will be going to a bowl looking for win number 8.
Yeah, I think, probably what we expected out of this game, Sean. Low scoring and Minnesota running a relatively conservative game plan. Don't know why. They threw it 24 times to be quite honest. I thought, in spite of Wisconsin's rushing defense, I thought this was a game where as long as the defense wasn't putrid, they would win. And sure enough, it happened. And good job on PJ Fleck. Kept the game boring, which there's nothing boring about winning. That's all I'll say for people just calling this another classic Big Ten West matchup. So Minnesota overall, pretty good year. Luke Fickell, not a shocking end necessarily to the third season, but nonetheless, kind of shows they have a lot of work to do in the offseason. So uh, for both teams, kind of just what we expected, to be honest, Sean. I don't think I could add much here. I think Darius Taylor's very good. I think Drake Lindsey made all the right decisions in this game because I think all you had to do was manage. Didn't have to play make too much and go first, like you said, looking for win number 8.
Yep, Minnesota gets the job done there. All right, Joe, let's go back to New Jersey. Penn State, Rutgers. The bowl eligibility bowl goes to the Nittany Lions, 40-36, a total shootout, up and down. Um, some incredible stat lines here. Allen 220 and a touchdown. Singleton had 2 touchdowns. You had Callie Kmanis throwing for 330 and 3 touchdowns. This was a really fun game on the side on Saturday night, with a lot of points. But it's Terry Smith and Penn State that end up being able to extend their season.
Yeah, what was kind of interesting is we thought Penn State's defense turned a corner. I think they made improvements, but I think overall,
Yeah.
when you look at the totality of the year, outside the James Franklin stuff and all the other sport storylines and whatnot, the defense took a massive step back, which is why they were even in a bowl eligibility bowl, for lack of a better term. Um, I think they were saved in large part thanks to Trot Allen. I think, kind of force feeding him is why they're going to a bowl game. I think Ethan Grunkemeyer looked very good at quarterback as well. But I don't really know, to be honest, because their rushing attack destroyed a very poor Rutgers run defense. I don't want to get that confused by anyone. And their defense kind of just treaded water in a way. And that's really not a good sign going into the bowl game per se. I know there's going to be wholesale changes at Penn State, and we're recording this on a Sunday night. I still don't know what the future looks like there. But in terms of this relative team, I think the offense made a lot of strides. I think they should have just ran the ball with Kaytron Allen the whole way, and probably they're not 6-6. But the defense, don't get it twisted. The defense was a problem the whole year. And that's kind of why we see the score here and why they have 6 losses. That's just the reality here, Sean.
Yeah, Rutgers was sort of like Washington in the way that they scored a lot of points, but when the competition ramped up, it went down. Like against I think Washington, they only get 19. Rutgers, they are Rutgers. Oregon, they only score 10. Ohio State, they only score 9. So it's a pretty good barometer that Penn State's defense is pretty far off. But they get the job done. Like you said, we're not sure about the future there, even though just about every coaching vacancy has been filled at this point, except for the 2 Big Ten jobs that were open. A third opened and then seems to have closed in a mere couple of hours. That'll be a different video, but I'm happy for Terry Smith and Penn State. I think they deserve a ton of credit for not quitting on the season. You lose your coach, and then you have 3 really, really tough games. You compete, I would say, pretty well in all 3 of them, lose them all, and then, they get the job done in the last 3 to go to a bowl. And, like I mentioned earlier, Joe, I think they might get elevated a spot or 2 just because the Penn State brand. They might be going to a little bit of a better bowl than they probably deserve, but we're going to have to see. It appears that James Franklin is bringing all of his recruits to Virginia Tech. So I think maybe one of the arguments for keeping Terry Smith was that you can keep the team and the recruits together. It doesn't seem like that's really going to happen. There's obviously some names that Penn State are circling around, but we'll get to that in another video. 2 more games, Joe. We got Maryland going up to Michigan State, and it's the Spartans that win 38-28. They pick up their first Big Ten win of the season. They give up a ton of offense to Malik Washington, 460 and 3 touchdowns. But it's not enough. Alessio Miljojevic, really good game, 4 touchdowns. And the Jonathan Smith era ends with a win.
Yeah, kind of, you know, a nice end to the Jonathan Smith era. I probably more MSU fans are happy that there's the end. This game, Sean, though, kind of showed what both teams' flaws were, particularly defensively. And then, you look at just as a whole, you kind of see why this year they were the bottom dwellers of the Big Ten, despite there being a lot of talent in these teams. Like you could justify Purdue being the bottom of the conference. Um, Wisconsin, Maryland, and Michigan State, I can't really justify, to be honest. Now, of course, some team has to be at the bottom. But when you look at the other teams that are like kind of floating in the middle, like Minnesota, Northwestern, uh, even Illinois to an extent, I think that's unfair due to the experience and coaching chops of that program. Uh, this game is kind of the byproduct of it. You had 2 teams that were just kind of going through the motions. I think Milihojevic played very well. I think Maryland does have something going with Malik Washington, but just kind of too many mistakes. And then defensively, getting 0 sacks, only 1 interception. This wasn't a Michigan State offense that was quite good. I mean, quite frankly, and the fact they give up 38 points kind of shows me. Good to see Nick Marsh get going again. Omari Kelly, Michigan State's receivers were the one bright spot of the team in spurts. I thought going into the year that'd be a lot bigger strength for the Spartans because I did think they'd win 7 games at least, and it was nice to see it on display. But obviously being in the toilet bowl, for lack of a better term, at Ford Field, it was pretty disappointing to see it come out that late. As opposed, better late than never, but nonetheless, still very disappointing.
It was a tough finish to the year for Maryland, Joe. If we were to go back to the first week in October, they were 4-0 with a 20-point lead against Washington. And they lose that game and then lose the remaining 7 after that. I think keeping Mike Locksley is pretty much tied to the fact that Malik Washington looks really promising. I think fans can cope and get around on that because their really good freshman quarterback is coming back. And then in terms of Michigan State, Joe, obviously Jonathan Smith was fired today, and they appear to have lined up his replacement already, but just not good enough 2 years in a row. Really not any growth. Their offense looked good at times. They had a few good players, but they weren't really able to put it all together really ever in these 2 years. But they did look pretty good here. You can just see how poor these two defenses are with how great some of these stat lines are. I mean, it is what it is. It probably was actually a pretty fun game from a footballing point of view to watch. Just under 1,000 total yards in the high 900s. So definitely not going to be any NFL scouts watching defensive tape here, but it was good that for Michigan State to end the year with a Big Ten win. All right, Joe, let's end this one up with perhaps one of the most miserable football games that I've ever seen from a weather point of view. Northwestern at Illinois in the snow. They ended up clearing three quarters of the stands to get all the fans on one side, and it was below the camera. So it really looked like it was COVID times playing in front of an empty crowd. Brett Bielema looked absolutely miserable every time the camera panned over to him. But his Fighting Illini get out of there with a 20-13 win. What an interesting way to end the season for these two teams who, in the grand scheme of things, other than the rivalry, this game doesn't really mean a whole lot. They're both going to a bowl, but Illinois gets the job done.
Yeah, this was the safe face game mainly for Illinois. I do not think anyone offensively played well. They just played less bad. Preston Stone had the 3 picks and
Yeah.
the fumble. Luke Altmaier, aerial ability was severely limited.
And their kicking
And
ability was too.
yeah, and without Caleb in there, they clearly struggled running the ball and they had no other option but to throw. I think this was not necessarily a weather loss. I think this was a roster loss more than anything. And, Illinois kind of capitalized and did what they were supposed to. I really don't want to analyze this game much longer, Sean. I had as much interest as anyone who bought their tickets who clearly didn't show up. Not saying not for a valid reason, but, kind of the headline of this game is better, more experienced team, made less mistakes, and that's why they won. They didn't do particularly anything that good. They just kind of waited for Northwestern to fall into the trap, and they did 4 times.
Yeah, it was a Big Ten off. You know,
Yep.
Everything really under 4th and 4 the teams would go for. Illinois went for it 4th and goal from the 6 once and didn't get it. It was it was cool to watch just because of the visual of the field, but really other than that, that was it. Illinois gets out of there, finishes the year 8-4. Joe, that's week 14. That's the regular season in the Big Ten. We're going to end it here. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.